She was 27, a widow, and down to her last 4 silver dollars. She had no family left to speak of, no plan to follow, and just one small brass-bound folding rule that had belonged to her husband. And, with that $4, she bought a derelict freight car, abandoned on a dead spur line outside of Laramie, Wyoming. The townsmen laughed at her folly. A woman buying a pile of rotting wood and rusted iron. But what nobody knew was that hidden deep within the car's sturdy frame was a secret that would not only silence their laughter, but change her life forever. Settle in and stay close with us. We love to hear where our stories find you, so please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Ada Mercer had not always been alone. She had come to Wyoming Territory 2 years prior with her husband Thomas, a man whose hands were as clever as his mind was kind. He was a carpenter and a surveyor by trade, a man who believed in the truth of a plumb line and the integrity of a well-set joint. He saw the world in terms of structure and potential, and he had taught Ada to see it the same way. He'd taught her how to read the grain of a piece of pine, how to estimate board feet with a glance, and how to use his 2-foot folding rule not just for measuring, but for understanding the bones of a thing. The rule was a beautiful object, made of boxwood with brass hinges and pins, its markings precise and clear. It had been his father's before him, and he had given it to her on their wedding day. To measure out a good life, he'd said, his smile quiet and sure. They had bought a small parcel of land with their savings, a place with a creek and a stand of cottonwoods, and Thomas had begun to build their home with his own hands while Ada planted a garden and learned the hard rhythms of the high plains. He was a man of few words but deep affections, and in their small, unfinished cabin, Ada had felt more secure than she ever had in her life. But the plains were as unforgiving as they were beautiful, and a fever that swept through the valley that first winter took Thomas from her in the space of a week, leaving her with an unfinished house, a half-plowed field, and a silence that was heavier than any stone. She tried to hold on, to finish the work they had started, but a woman alone was a poor credit risk, and the bank that held the note on their land was not sentimental. The notice of foreclosure was not delivered with anger or malice, but with a quiet administrative finality that was somehow worse. A man in a clean shirt and a dusty bowler hat handed her the papers, his eyes avoiding hers, and told her she had 30 days. She did not weep or plead. Thomas had taught her that dignity was in the work, not in the asking. For those 30 days she worked, harvesting what she could from her garden, mending her clothes, and packing her few possessions into a single trunk. On the last day, she stood in the doorway of the cabin, the wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair. She ran her hand over the door frame Thomas had set, the wood smooth and perfect. She took one last look at the empty space where their life was supposed to have been, and then she closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place like the closing of a book. She had sold her wagon and mule for enough money to settle her accounts at the general store and purchase a ticket on a stagecoach to Laramie, a town she knew only by name. She arrived with her trunk, the folding rule in her apron pocket, and less than $5 to her name. She took a room at a boarding house, a small, clean space that smelled of lye soap and loneliness, and began to look for work. But work for a woman was scarce: laundry, mending, cleaning, and it paid barely enough to cover her rent. Each day, her small store of money dwindled, the coins shrinking in her purse until all that remained were 4 heavy silver dollars. It was then that she saw the notice for the sheriff's auction of delinquent properties and abandoned assets. She went not with any real hope, but because she felt she had to do something, to take some action rather than simply wait for her last dollar to be spent. It was an act of defiance against the quiet, creeping despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The auction was held in the dusty square in front of the courthouse, a gathering of men in worn coats and Stetsons, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They were ranchers, merchants, and foremen from the Union Pacific Yard, all looking for a bargain. Ada stood at the edge of the crowd, a small, solitary figure, feeling the weight of their sideways glances. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a stained waistcoat, worked his way through a list of unclaimed freight, broken tools, and a sway-backed horse that looked even more tired than she felt. The bidding was brisk and businesslike. Then, he announced the final item. Lot 27. One B&O boxcar, number 743, currently situated on the abandoned Black Creek spur line. Sold, as is, where is. Removal is the buyer's responsibility. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The old spur line was a local joke, a failed venture from a decade ago that led 5 miles to a played-out quarry and ended in a tangle of sagebrush. The freight car that sat there was considered less than worthless. It was an eyesore and an obstacle. What am I bid for this fine piece of railroad history? The auctioneer bellowed, a smirk on his face. Shall we start the bidding at $1? A man near the front called out, I'll give you $1 if you haul it away for me. More laughter. Ada, however, was not looking at the broken wheels or the peeling paint described by the auctioneer. She was looking at the faded numbers he had called out. B&O 743. Thomas had once worked for the Baltimore and Ohio line back east, and he had told her stories of the different cars. He'd explained that the older work cars, the ones built to house survey crews or track gangs, were often modified, their interiors customized by the men who lived in them. They were built to be sturdy, self-contained little worlds. While the men around her saw a wreck, Ada saw a structure. She saw seasoned oak timbers and forged iron braces. She saw a roof that, even if it leaked, was still a roof. She saw shelter. A man in a dusty railroad coat stood near her, his arms crossed. He had a stern, quiet face, and he wasn't laughing with the others. He watched her, his gaze sharp and curious. This was Henry Pike, the Union Pacific foreman, a man who knew every spike and tie for 100 miles. He saw her studying not the car's decay, but its form, her expression intent and focused, and he saw something the others missed entirely. $1 bid, the auctioneer said, trying to move things along. Another man shouted, $2. For the firewood. $3. A third man offered, joining the joke. The auctioneer looked around, ready to gavel it down. Do I hear $4? It was then that Ada stepped forward. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady. $4. A sudden silence fell over the crowd. Every head turned to look at her. The laughter died, replaced by a kind of stunned, derisive pity. The auctioneer blinked, genuinely surprised. $4 from the lady. Going once? Going twice? He scanned the crowd of grinning faces. Sold. To the widow Mercer for $4. He banged the gavel, and a fresh wave of chuckles and murmurs spread through the men. Ada ignored them. She walked to the clerk's table, her back straight, and carefully counted out her 4 silver dollars. The clerk handed her the bill of sale, a single sheet of paper that felt as heavy and as final as a gravestone. She folded it, tucked it into her pocket, and turned to walk away from the courthouse, the sound of the men's fading laughter following her like a bitter wind. Her journey was not one of great distance, but it was a passage from one state of being to another. She walked from the center of town, where the buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, out past the livery and the blacksmith's shop, toward the edge of Laramie, where the neat grid of streets dissolved into open country. The town was behind her, a place of judgment and dwindling opportunity. Ahead of her lay the vast, empty expanse of the high plains, the sky a dome of brilliant, indifferent blue. The wind, a constant presence here, pressed against her, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass and the faint, far-off smell of pine from the mountains. She followed the main line of the Union Pacific for a quarter of a mile, the steel rails gleaming in the sun, a symbol of connection to a world that felt impossibly distant. Then she saw it, the rusted switch, the track that veered off and disappeared into the sagebrush. This was the Black Creek Spur. The rails were dull and pitted, the wooden ties were cracked and weathered, some of them half buried in the sandy soil. Weeds grew thick between them. It was a line that went nowhere, a testament to a forgotten ambition. She followed the track as it curved gently away from the main line, the silence broken only by the crunch of her boots on the gravel and the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. After a 10-minute walk, she saw the freight car. It stood alone, looking like some great wounded animal that had come here to die. It was bigger than she had imagined, nearly 40 feet long. Its sides weathered to a silvery gray, streaked with the rust-colored tears of weeping iron bolts. The paint, once a deep oxide red, clung in brittle patches. The large letters B&O and the number 743 were still visible, like faint scars. One of the axles was broken, causing the whole car to list to one side, its door hanging askew from a single hinge. It looked derelict, abandoned, and utterly forlorn. But Ada saw more. She saw the heavy oak beams of the undercarriage, timbers that were still sound despite the years of neglect. She saw the craftsmanship in the iron trusses and the corner plates. It was battered and broken, but it had been built to last. She walked around it slowly, her hand trailing along the rough, sun-warmed wood. She felt a strange sense of kinship with this forgotten object. It too was a relic of a past life, cast off and deemed worthless. As she stood there, contemplating the enormous task she had set for herself with her last $4, she heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel behind her. She turned to see the railroad foreman from the auction, Henry Pike. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much sun and too many miles of track. He wasn't smiling. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "that's a lot of firewood for $4. His tone wasn't mocking, but matter-of-fact. Ada met his gaze directly. "I don't intend to burn it," she said. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the car, taking in the broken axle, the sagging roofline, the general state of decay. He saw what the other men saw, but like her, he also saw the bones beneath. He was a man who understood structure. Axles snapped clean through, he observed. Trucks twisted. She ain't rolling anywhere soon. "I don't need her to roll," Ada replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I just need her to stand." Pike looked from the car back to her, and for the first time, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even respect, entered his eyes. He saw the set of her jaw, the lack of fear in her posture. He saw a woman who was not defeated, but assessing. He had seen that look before, in track foremen facing a washout and in engineers nursing a failing locomotive over a high mountain pass. It was the look of someone squaring up to a problem, not running from it. "Well," he said after a long moment, "the frame is sound. That's something." He gave a curt nod, as if confirming a fact to himself, and then turned and walked back toward the main line without another word, leaving Ada alone with her enormous broken $4 home. The air inside the car was thick and stale, smelling of decades of dust, mouse droppings, and the faint, ghostly scent of coal smoke and old wool. Sunlight filtered through the grimy panes of a small window at one end, and through the gaps in the warped planking of the walls, striping the dusty floor with narrow bands of light. Cobwebs, heavy and gray as funeral shrouds, hung from the ceiling beams. The space was cavernous and empty, save for a few remnants of its former life. Against one wall were two sets of built-in wooden bunks, their rough mattresses long since rotted into nests for pack rats. At the far end, a small pot-bellied stove, its iron body red with rust, stood cold and silent. And along the other wall, beneath the grimy window, was a long, sturdy workbench, its surface scarred with the marks of countless projects, saw cuts, oil stains, and the circular ghosts of paint cans. This, Ada knew, was the heart of the car. This was where the work had been done. She set her small bag down and took a deep breath, the dust catching in her throat. The task ahead was overwhelming, but she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This place was hers. It was broken and dirty and forgotten, but it belonged to her. She had a place to stand. She began with the simple, methodical act of cleaning. She had brought a broom and a bucket with her, purchased with the few cents she had left after buying the car. She opened the one good door as wide as it would go, propping it open with a rock to let in the air and light. She started at one end, sweeping the thick layer of dirt and debris toward the open door. The rhythmic scrape of the bristles on the wood, a comforting, purposeful sound. It was work, and work was something she understood. As she swept, she uncovered the history of the car, layer by layer. She found a rusted railroad spike, a deck of playing cards that had turned to brittle wafers, a tin button from a pair of overalls. Each object was a small echo of the men who had lived and worked here. It took her the better part of the afternoon to sweep the floor clean. The sunlight was slanting low through the open door when she finally finished, her arms aching and her face smudged with dirt. The car was still a wreck, but it was an ordered wreck now. The floor was bare, revealing the solid oak planking, worn smooth in paths between the bunks, the stove, and the workbench. It was then, as she stood surveying her work, that she turned her full attention to the workbench. Thomas had taught her to look closely at how things were made. The story of a thing is in its joints, he used to say. The workbench was made of heavy pine, its top a single, thick slab. But as she ran her hand along its front edge, her fingers traced a fine, almost invisible line in the wood. It was too straight, too perfect to be a crack. She knelt for a closer look. The grain of the wood on the front panel of the bench was slightly different from the wood on the top and sides. It was a subtle thing, something a casual observer would never notice. She pressed on the panel, but it was solid. She tried to find a latch or a handle, but there was nothing. Remembering her husband's folding rule in her pocket, she took it out. The brass felt cool and solid in her hand. She unfolded a section and used it to check the seams of the workbench, measuring the depth, checking for square. Everything was perfect, the craftsmanship impeccable. And yet, that one faint line remained, an intentional disruption in the pattern. She thought about the men who built these cars, men like Thomas, who lived by their wits and their hands. A hiding place would not be obvious. It would be part of the structure itself. She examined the underside of the bench, her fingers exploring the heavy support brackets. Near the right-hand corner, beneath the top slab, her fingers brushed against a small, round indentation in the wood. It was a knothole, but it felt too smooth, too regular. She pressed her thumb into it and felt a faint click. A section of the front panel, about 2 feet long, sprang open a fraction of an inch. Her heart began to beat a little faster. With trembling fingers, she pried the panel open. It was a cleverly concealed door on hidden wooden hinges. Inside, nestled in the dark hollow space, was a flat, rectangular tin box, its surface coated in a thin layer of dust. It was heavy when she lifted it out. She carried it to the doorway, into the fading light of the setting sun, and sat down on the threshold of her new home. The box was not locked, but the lid was sealed tight with wax. She used the edge of her husband's rule to carefully break the seal and pry it open. Inside, wrapped in a sheath of oilcloth to protect them from moisture, was a thick bundle of papers tied with a faded red ribbon. Beneath the papers lay a small, heavy leather pouch. Ada's hands shook slightly as she untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the documents. The paper was stiff and crackled with age, the ink a faded brown. The first document was a bill of sale, written in an elegant looping script. It recorded the sale of one Baltimore and Ohio work car, number 743, from the railroad to a man named Elias Vance for the sum of $100. The date on the document was 1870, more than a decade ago. Beneath it was a series of official-looking land grants from the United States General Land Office, granting title to Elias Vance for a right-of-way extending 5 miles from the Union Pacific Main Line, along with mineral and timber rights to the adjacent parcels of land. It was the entire Black Creek Spur. There were surveyor's maps, meticulously drawn, detailing the route of the spur line to the quarry. And there were lien papers showing that Mr. Vance had personally financed the construction of the line, placing liens against the land and all associated assets, including, specifically, car number 743 as collateral for his investment. The final document was a single sheet of paper, a legal addendum to the bill of sale for the car. Attached to it was a handwritten letter. Ada unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was the same as on the bill of sale, precise and clear. It read, "To whomever finds this, September 12, 1872. My name is Elias Vance. I was the chief surveyor and the sole financier for the Black Creek Quarry spur line. I believed in this venture. I believed in the quality of the stone in that quarry and in the promise of this territory. I invested all I had in laying this track in the hope of building something that would last. It has become clear to me that my partners in Cheyenne do not share my vision. They are men of speculation, not of construction. They have overextended the company's credit and will soon drive it into bankruptcy to settle their other, more foolish debts. They believe this spur line and this old work car to be worthless assets. They are mistaken. I have consulted with a lawyer. By the terms of our agreement and the liens I hold, all physical assets of the spur line are legally bound together. The land grants, the right-of-way, the rails, the ties, and this car, number 743, are a single, indivisible property. I have legally bundled them as such. Whoever holds the clear title to this car holds the title to it all. I have no heir to leave this to, and I fear I will be ruined along with the company. I am hiding these documents here, in the car where I drew the maps and planned the work, as an act of faith. Perhaps one day, someone with the eyes to see the value in a forgotten thing will come along. Perhaps it will be a person who understands the worth of good work and a solid foundation. I leave this not as a treasure, but as an opportunity. It will require labor to make it worth anything again. The track will need clearing, the quarry will need work. But the right is sound, and the title is clear. In the pouch, you will find $200 in gold coin. It is not much, but it may be enough to make a start. Use it wisely. I hope this finds a good home. I hope the work I started may one day be finished. Sincerely, Elias Vance. Ada read the letter twice, her eyes tracing the careful, deliberate script. The words of this man, this stranger from the past, spoke directly to her own heart. He too had believed in building something, and he too had been defeated by the cold arithmetic of other men's ambitions. She reached into the box and lifted out the leather pouch. It was heavy, and when she loosened the drawstring, the unmistakable gleam of gold coins shone in the twilight. She poured them into her hand. 10 $20 gold pieces. $200. It was a fortune. It was a new beginning. She sat there on the threshold of the broken freight car, the letter in one hand and a fortune in the other, and for the first time since Thomas had died, she wept. They were not tears of sorrow or of self-pity, but tears of profound, aching relief. The sun had set, and a cool breeze was blowing down from the mountains. She carefully folded the letter and the documents, placed them and the coins back in the tin box, and held it close. The laughter of the men in the town square seemed like a distant echo from another lifetime. They had laughed at the foolish widow who had spent her last $4 on a pile of junk. They did not know that she had not bought a wreck, she had bought a future. She had bought the whole damn line. The next morning, Ada rose before the sun, her mind clear and focused. The emotional tide of the previous evening had receded, leaving behind a bedrock of purpose. She knew she could not do this alone. The documents in the tin box were powerful, but they were just paper until they were recognized by the law and backed by knowledge she did not possess. Her first stop was not the courthouse, but the Union Pacific Rail Yard. She found Henry Pike near the roundhouse, directing a crew that was replacing a damaged coupling on a locomotive. He stood amidst the hiss of steam and the clang of steel, a man entirely in his element. He saw her approaching and walked to meet her, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. His expression was as blunt and guarded as it had been the day before. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "Come to sell me that firewood after all?" Ada looked up at him, her gaze steady. "No, Mr. Pike, I've come to ask for your counsel." She held out the tin box. "I would be grateful if you would look at something for me. Something I found in the car." Pike's eyes narrowed with curiosity. He hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward a small shed that served as his office. Inside, the room smelled of strong coffee and metal filings. He cleared a space on a cluttered desk. Ada opened the box and laid out Elias Vance's documents, smoothing the creased paper with her palm. Pike bent over the desk, his initial skepticism giving way to a low whistle of astonishment as he read. He picked up the surveyor's map, his calloused finger tracing the path of the spur line. He read the land grants, his lips moving silently. He understood the language of these papers, the legal and physical reality they represented. When he finally looked up at her, the gruffness was gone from his face, replaced by a look of profound respect. "Good God, woman," he breathed. "You didn't buy a boxcar, you bought a railroad." He explained to her, in his practical, no-nonsense way, what she possessed. The right-of-way was the key. It gave her control of the 5-mile corridor of land, a valuable asset in a territory where land was everything. "You need a lawyer," he said, his mind already working on the problem. "Not one of the fat ones who work for the cattle barons. You need someone young and hungry. Abernathy. He has an office over the Mercantile. He's smart, and the town's establishment hasn't bought him yet." Ada tucked the papers safely back in their box. "Thank you, Mr. Pike. Don't thank me yet," he grumbled, though his eyes held a new warmth. "The paperwork is one thing. Making that line worth a damn is another." Following his advice, Ada went to see Mr. Abernathy. His office was a small, dusty room filled with more books than furniture. He was a young man with a thin mustache and an intense, serious expression. He listened to her story, his face a mask of professional skepticism, but as he examined the documents, his eyes widened. He spent nearly an hour reading, cross-referencing dates, and checking the language of the liens. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a look of incredulous excitement on his face. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice hushed with awe. This is ironclad. The chain of title is unbroken. The liens are properly filed and were never discharged. The territory's abandonment laws don't apply because the property was never unclaimed, merely dormant. When the sheriff auctioned the car, he unwittingly auctioned the entire attached property. It's the most brilliantly obscure piece of legal maneuvering I have ever seen. Together, they walked to the Laramie County Courthouse. The clerk, a balding man who had been at the auction, smirked when he saw Ada. "Come to file a complaint about that pile of splinters you bought?" he asked. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward and placed the bill of sale and the land grants on the counter. "We've come to file a transfer of title for the Black Creek Spur Line and its associated properties to its new owner, Mrs. Ada Mercer." The clerk's smirk vanished. He stared at the documents, his face paling. He called over his superior. There was a flurry of confused, angry whispering. They checked their own records, their disbelief turning to grudging acceptance. The paperwork was undeniable. An hour later, Ada walked out of the courthouse, with freshly stamped and recorded deeds in her name. The news spread through Laramie like a grass fire. The men who had laughed at her were now silent, their mockery replaced by stunned disbelief and a healthy dose of fear. They had laughed at a poor widow. They had not realized they were laughing at the owner of 5 miles of Wyoming. The legal victory was quiet and absolute, but Ada knew it was only the beginning. Ownership on paper meant nothing without the physical reality to back it up. The spur line was still a 5-mile stretch of dereliction, and her home was still a broken-down freight car. The work had to begin. She used $10 of Elias Vance's gold to buy supplies at the general store, heavy work gloves, a new bucket, lye soap, a lantern, oil, and basic provisions. The storekeeper, who had been among the laughers, now treated her with a cautious, deferential respect that she found more satisfying than any apology. Her first task was to make the car habitable. She spent 2 days scrubbing it from top to bottom, washing away the grime of years. The lye soap and hot water stripped away the filth, revealing the clean, honest grain of the wood beneath. She repaired the broken door hinge with a piece of leather and some salvaged nails, so it now closed securely. She carefully cleaned the panes of the small window until the sunlight streamed in, bright and clear. The space began to transform from a derelict shell into a simple, clean shelter. Henry Pike appeared on the 3rd day, unannounced, carrying a heavy toolbox. He set it down without a word and began to inspect the car's undercarriage. "You're sitting on a broken axle," he stated, not unkindly. First big wind, she could tip over. Over the next week, he spent his evenings after his shift at the rail yard helping her. He was a patient, exacting teacher. He showed her how to use heavy jacks to lift the corner of the car, how to block it securely with heavy timbers so it sat level and stable. He brought a replacement bearing from the yard scrap pile and showed her how to heat and set it. He helped her patch the leaking roof with tar and canvas. He spoke little, but his actions were a constant lesson in competence and self-reliance. He taught her the names of tools she'd never seen before: a track wrench, a spike maul, a tamping bar. He showed her how to sight down a rail to check for alignment, how to listen to the ring of a spike being driven to know if it was secure. Under his tutelage, Ada's hands, once accustomed to needle and thread, grew calloused and strong. She learned the satisfying ache of a body used for hard, productive labor. One evening, as they worked on the rusted pot-bellied stove, she asked him why he was helping her. He stopped his work, turning a bolt over in his hands. "My wife," he said. His voice low and rough. "She was a smart, capable woman. Built a life for us out of nothing. After she passed, I saw how quick the world is to dismiss a woman on her own. You remind me of her. You see the work that needs doing, and you ain't afraid to do it." It was the most he had ever said about his personal life, and Ada understood it was a profound expression of trust. Their next project was the stove. It was seized with rust, its flue pipe choked with an old bird's nest. They took it apart piece by piece, cleaning each part with wire brushes and oil. For the cracked firebox, they needed a blacksmith. Pike directed her to Silas Croft, an old man with a forge at the edge of town. Croft was a man of even fewer words than Pike, his face permanently grim from years of heat and smoke. He listened to Ada's request, examined the cracked iron piece she brought him, and simply grunted, "Come back tomorrow." When she returned, the piece was perfectly welded, the seam almost invisible. "What do I owe you?" she asked. He waved a dismissive, soot-stained hand. "Pike said you're good for it. Pay me when you can." The act of kindness, delivered with such gruffness, touched her deeply. That night, for the first time, she lit a fire in the stove. The little car filled with a gentle, radiating warmth, chasing away the chill of the Wyoming night. She sat at her workbench, which she now used as a table, watching the flames dance behind the grate, and felt a profound sense of peace. She was not just surviving, she was building. Word of Ada's project, and of Henry Pike's involvement, had become the main topic of conversation in Laramie. The initial shock and disbelief had given way to a grudging admiration. People were beginning to see what she was doing not as a fluke of legal luck, but as a serious enterprise. The first person to approach her with a business proposition was a rancher named John Corrigan. He was a big, weathered man with a sprawling ranch about 10 miles north of the spur line. He rode out one afternoon, his horse picking its way carefully along the overgrown tracks, and reined in before her freight car. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, tipping his hat. He had a direct, appraising gaze. "I hear you own this line now." "I do," Ada said, stepping out of the car. "I also hear you're aiming to clear it," he went on. "Is that so?" "It is." Corrigan chewed on this for a moment. his eyes scanning the cleared section of track near the car, then the long, sage-choked line stretching into the distance. "It costs me a fortune in time and lost weight on my cattle to drive them all the way to the main stockyards in Laramie," he said. "If I could load them here, right at the junction with the main line, it would save me 2 days. I'd pay for that convenience. I'd pay well." He was not just making an offer, he was testing her. Ada understood this immediately. "The line is 5 miles long, Mr. Corrigan. Clearing it is a big job." "I know it," he said, "which is why I'm prepared to help. I've got 5 men and a team of mules that are idle between haying and roundup. They could have this track cleared to the quarry in a month." Ada considered his offer. It was more than fair, it was a lifeline. But she would not appear desperate. "What are your terms?" she asked, her voice even. "No charge for the labor," he said. "Call it an investment. In return, I get exclusive loading rights at the junction for the first year, at a fair rate we both agree on. After that, we negotiate like any other customer." Ada extended her hand. "Mr. Corrigan, you have a deal." The next Monday, Corrigan's men arrived. They were rough, hard-working men who initially seemed unsure what to make of this woman who owned a railroad. But Ada worked alongside them, clearing brush, pulling stubborn weeds, her determination earning their quiet respect. The work was grueling. They tore out thick sagebrush that had grown for years, its roots like iron claws in the dry soil. They shoveled away sand and dirt that had drifted over the tracks. They replaced cracked and rotted ties, using the good timber Elias Vance had known was on the land. Pike showed them how to regrade sections of the trackbed and tamp the ballast for stability. Slowly, painstakingly, the spur line began to re-emerge from the landscape, a thin but determined line of steel and wood. As they worked, others from the town began to appear. One day, Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, arrived in a small cart, bringing a large pot of hot stew and a loaf of fresh bread. "A body can't live on hard work alone," she said simply. And from then on, she came twice a week, her practical kindness a welcome reprieve from the hard labor. Silas Croft, the blacksmith, came out to repair the men's tools when they broke, refusing any payment beyond a cup of coffee. Even Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer, would walk out on a Sunday afternoon to check on their progress, marveling at the physical reality of the legal case he had won. Ada's freight car, once a symbol of her poverty, had become the headquarters of a thriving enterprise, a center of activity and purpose. People no longer called her the Widow Mercer in tones of pity. They called her Miss Mercer, the owner of the Black Creek Line, and their voices held the unmistakable ring of respect. The day the last section of track was cleared felt like a quiet celebration. The 5-mile line now ran clean and unbroken from the Union Pacific Main Line to the Old Stone Quarry. The rails, scoured of their rust by the hard work and the passage of a handcart, shone under the autumn sun. John Corrigan's investment had paid off for them both. He brought his first herd of cattle to the junction, and his men built a temporary loading pen. Henry Pike arranged for a Union Pacific switch engine to pull an empty stock car onto the spur, the first locomotive to touch that track in over a decade. Ada stood on the steps of her freight car, which now served as her home and the line's main office, and watched the operation. She had a ledger on her workbench, and in it she made her first official entry, October 14, 1882. 1 car, 50 head of cattle, shipped for John Corrigan. Payment received, $20. It was a small amount, but it was real. It was the sound of her enterprise breathing its first breath. Her freight car was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. The pot-bellied stove kept it warm against the increasingly chilly nights. She had built a small pantry for her supplies and a shelf for her few books. The interior, once a cavern of filth and despair, was now clean, orderly, and filled with the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. It was small and simple, but it was the first home that was truly hers, built not just with money, but with her own 2 hands. In the evenings, Henry Pike would often walk out from town after his shift. He would sit with her on the steps of the car, sharing a cup of coffee as the stars emerged in the vast, dark sky. They rarely spoke of the past. Instead, they talked of the future. They talked about the quality of the stone in the quarry and whether it could be sold to the railroad for ballast. They talked about extending the line another 10 miles to reach the timber stands in the foothills. He would listen to her ideas, offering practical advice and quiet encouragement. A gentle, unspoken companionship grew between them, forged in the shared language of hard work and mutual respect. One evening, as a light snow began to fall, dusting the plains in a thin layer of white, Ada was sitting alone inside the car. The lantern cast a warm, golden glow on the wooden walls. She had the tin box open on her workbench. She took out Elias Vance's meticulously drawn map of the spur line and spread it out. Next to it, she placed her husband's brass-bound folding rule. The two objects lay side by side, the grand vision of a man she had never met, and the practical tool of the man she had loved and lost. She thought of Thomas, of his belief in good work and solid foundations. He would have loved this car, she thought. He would have admired the craftsmanship of the hidden compartment, and he would have understood, better than anyone, the quiet triumph of turning a derelict thing into something whole and useful again. She looked out her small, clean window at the track stretching away into the snowy darkness. The world had dismissed her as a poor, helpless widow. The men in the town had laughed at her desperation. They saw a woman with nothing, spending her last few dollars on a piece of trash. They could not see the knowledge Thomas had given her. They could not see the foresight of Elias Vance, waiting patiently in a hidden tin box. And they could not see the quiet strength that is forged in loss and solitude. The laughter had long since died, replaced by the rumble of freight cars and the lowing of cattle. Ada Mercer was no longer an object of pity or scorn in Laramie. She was a fixture, a businesswoman whose name was spoken with a measure of awe. The Black Creek spur line was a modest but steady success. After Corrigan's cattle, other ranchers had followed, grateful for the shorter, easier route to market. Ada had even negotiated a small contract with the Union Pacific to haul stone from the quarry for track ballast, just as she and Pike had discussed. Elias Vance's hope was being realized, his work finally completed. She had paid back Silas Croft for his work on the stove, and Mrs. Gable now sold her bread and pies at a small depot Ada had built near the junction. Mr. Abernathy handled her legal affairs, his practice growing alongside her own reputation. She had not just built a business, she had nurtured a small, interconnected community, all of them tied together by 5 miles of steel track. She still lived in the freight car. She had added a small extension for a proper bedroom, the new pine boards smelling clean and sharp, but the car itself remained the heart of her home and her operation. It was a constant reminder of where she had started. It was her $4 castle, her fortress of solitude, the place where her life had turned. On the second anniversary of the auction, she stood in the open doorway of the car, looking out at the land she now knew so well. The evening air was cool and smelled of rain. Henry Pike was walking up the track from town, his familiar, steady gait a comforting sight. In his hand, he carried a small bundle of wildflowers. He had become her partner, not just in business, but in life, their quiet companionship blossoming into a deep and abiding affection. He stopped before her, a rare, gentle smile on his face, and handed her the flowers. "Happy anniversary," he said. She took them, their bright colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of the prairie. "It's not our anniversary," she said, though a smile played on her own lips. "It is," he corrected her gently. "It's the anniversary of the day you bought a railroad. The day I knew my life was about to change." She looked from his face to the track, then back again. The memory of the auction was no longer a sting of humiliation, but a strange and cherished foundation myth. The scorn of the crowd had been the unlikely crucible in which her new life was forged. Ada Mercer was 27 and a widow with $4 to her name when she came to Laramie. She spent it all on a forgotten freight car at the edge of town. It was the best $4 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found a piece of your own heart in Ada's journey, we hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates the power of quiet strength. We're left wondering, what is something that others dismissed, but you saw the hidden value in? Let us know in the comments below. We'll see you next time. What would you do if you were cast out with nothing but the clothes on your back, a tired old horse, and $2 silver to your name? What if the only thing you could afford was the one thing everyone else had written off as worthless? For 20-year-old Lucinda Hale, arriving in the dust-choked town of Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1879, this wasn't a question. It was the hard, sharp edge of her reality. She paid her last $2 for a derelict ice house on the edge of town, a place so forgotten it was a joke to the townsfolk. But what they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that buried deep in the rot and sawdust was a secret sealed since the war, a truth that would rewrite the history of the town and the destiny of the girl they had so easily dismissed. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about how the things we discard often hold the very thing we need the most. Lucinda Hale in Redemption Creek, not with a flourish, but like a stray leaf blown in by a weary wind. She and the old mare Dust walked the last 5 miles. The wagon that had carried them from the east sold for pennies in the previous town to pay for a bag of oats and a heel of bread. The mare's head hung low, her gait a slow, rhythmic plod that mirrored the beat of Lucinda's own tired heart. Lucinda's dress, a faded calico that had once been her Sunday best, was gray with the dust of 3 states. Her face, framed by strands of brown hair that had escaped her tight bun, was smudged with dirt and sorrow, her eyes holding the deep, still quiet of someone who had seen too much loss in her 20 years. Her father, a good man with a mind for numbers and a heart too soft for the world, was gone. A sudden fever had taken him, leaving his accounts and his only daughter in the hands of his business partner, Jedediah Barlow. Barlow, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, had been swift. He had patted her hand, spoken of her father's unfortunate debts, and presented her with a ledger whose columns of red ink swam before her tear-filled eyes. He had pressed a handful of dollars into her palm, a gesture of his supposed generosity, and told her it was time she made her own way. She knew, with the gut-deep certainty of the wronged, that the ledger was a lie. She knew her father had been meticulous, solvent, but she was a girl, alone, with no one to stand for her. To argue would have been to invite a worse fate. So she had packed a small canvas satchel with her mother's locket, her father's worn whetstone, a change of underthings, and a single heavy book. She had taken the one asset Barlow couldn't liquidate on paper, the old mare, a creature as worn and overlooked as she now felt herself to be, and she had walked west, toward a name on a map her father had once mentioned in passing, Redemption Creek. The name felt like a cruel joke. The town, when she finally saw it, did little to lift her spirits. It was a collection of unpainted plank buildings, huddled along a single wide street, cowering under a vast and indifferent sky. The wind carried the scent of manure from the livery, stale beer from the saloon, and the fine, gritty dust that seemed to be the town's primary crop. As she led Dust toward the public trough, she felt the eyes of the town upon her. Men sitting on the porch of the general store stopped their whittling. Women sweeping their stoops paused, brooms held mid-air. They saw the worn dress, the exhausted horse, the solitary figure of a young woman arriving with no escort and no baggage to speak of. Their gazes were not hostile, not yet, but they were heavy with appraisal and suspicion. A woman alone was a problem to be solved, a vulnerability to be exploited, or a temptation to be condemned. Lucinda kept her eyes down, focusing on the rhythmic splash of water as Dust drank gratefully. She had learned that silence and stillness were her only armor. She gave the mare the last of the oats, her own stomach a tight, aching knot. She had $2 left in the world, sewn into the hem of her shift. It was a fortune and nothing at all. She needed shelter before the cold Missouri night fell, a place to rest her head that wasn't the open prairie. Her gaze drifted to the sheriff's office, where a public board displayed deeds for sale and notices of unclaimed land. It was her last, desperate hope. She tied dust loosely to the hitching post, murmuring a soft promise to return, and walked with a straightness in her spine she did not feel toward the board. Her fingers, rough and chapped, traced the curling script on the posted papers. A small parcel of farmland, $30. A town lot with a burned-out foundation, $15. A room for rent at the boarding house, $4 a week, paid in advance. Each price was a door slamming shut in her face. Her eyes scanned lower, past the respectable properties, down to the bottom of the board where the forgotten things were listed. And there, on a yellowed, fly-specked piece of paper, she saw it. A single line written in a dismissive scrawl, the Old North Ice House. As is, beside it, the price was written in stark, damning figures. 2 naucents, $2. The exact sum that stood between her and utter destitution. She stared at the listing, a strange stillness settling over her. An ice house, a dark, cold, half-buried place designed to hold the dead of winter. It felt fitting. A shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill ran down her spine. She had no other choice. She took a deep breath, the dust filling her lungs, and pushed open the door to the clerk's office. The bell above the door chimed a single, tinny note, announcing her arrival to a future she could not possibly imagine. A future that lay waiting, buried in the cold, dark silence of the most worthless property in Redemption Creek. The clerk, a man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting from boredom to mild annoyance. "Help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. Lucinda's voice was quiet but clear. "I'd like to buy the old ice house." The man blinked. He put down his pen, took off his visor, and polished it with his sleeve as if to see her better. Then a slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "The ice house," he repeated, the word stretched out in disbelief. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Miss, you don't want that place. It's a ruin. Hasn't been used since before the war. The roof's caved in. It's full of 20-year-old sawdust and rats the size of cats. The town uses it for a dump." Lucinda simply stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze steady. "It's listed for $2. The clerk's amusement deepened. "That's not a price, that's a dare," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's what the county figures it'll cost someone to tear it down." He gestured vaguely out the window. "You're new here. You don't understand." But Lucinda did understand. She understood the hollow ache of having no other options. She understood the finality of a closed door. "I have $2, she said, her voice unwavering. "I'll take it." The sound of the clerk's laughter drew the attention of 2 men who had been loitering by the stove. They drifted closer, their faces alight with the cruel curiosity of bored men. One of them was Jedediah Barlow. He had ridden into town that afternoon, his horse fresh, his suit clean. Seeing Lucinda standing there, dusty and defiant, a smirk played on his lips. "Well, I'll be," Barlow said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Little Lucy Hale, buying up property. What is it, girl? Decided to become a real estate magnate?" He stepped forward, his polished boots loud on the floorboards. "What's she buying, Tom?" The clerk, eager for an audience, gestured dramatically. "The old ice house." The men erupted in laughter. It wasn't a kind sound. It was sharp and dismissive, the laughter of those who have and who mock those who have not. "The ice house," Barlow boomed, slapping his thigh. "An ice castle for an ice queen. Fitting." Lucinda's face burned, but she did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the clerk, who was now beginning to feel a sliver of pity, or perhaps just a desire to finish the absurd transaction. He sighed, pulling a dusty deed from a drawer. "It's your money," he muttered, dipping his pen in the inkwell. "Name's Lucinda Hale?" She nodded as he wrote. She carefully unstitched the hem of her dress and produced 2 worn silver dollars, placing them on the counter. The coins seemed to absorb all the light in the room. They were her past and her future, her final connection to the life she had lost. The clerk took the money, his fingers brushing hers. He slid the deed and a single, large, rust-pitted iron key across the counter. "She's all yours," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier mockery, now just flat and tired. Lucinda took the paper and the key, her fingers closing around the cold metal. It was heavy, real. She had bought a ruin. She had purchased her own joke. But as she turned and walked out of the office, the sound of Barlow's laughter following her, she held her head high. She owned something. It was next to nothing, but it was hers. What could possibly be waiting inside that forgotten place? Why would a young woman, cast out and alone, spend her last dollar on a structure everyone else saw as trash? What secret does 20 years of settled sawdust hold? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden history. The journey to the ice house and the truth it held was only just beginning. As Lucinda stepped back into the street, the deed clutched in one hand and the heavy key in the other, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sun was lower now, casting long, distorted shadows that made the town look skeletal. The whispers followed her as she untied dust from the hitching post. They were no longer just curious. They were laced with amusement and a kind of pity that felt sharper than scorn. "Bought the old ice house," a woman murmured to her neighbor, shaking her head. "Poor thing must be touched in the head." A group of boys playing with a hoop stopped and pointed, their faces open with childish cruelty. Lucinda felt their stares like stones against her back, but she kept walking. Her focus narrowed to the simple, rhythmic task of putting one foot in front of the other. She led the mare past the blacksmith's shop, where the clang of the hammer paused as she went by. She passed the saloon, and the laughter from within spilled out, seeming to mock her personally. Jedediah Barlow rode up alongside her, his horse a fine, glossy chestnut that made Dust look even more pathetic. He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock chivalry. "A word of advice, Miss Hale," he said, his voice oozing false concern. "There's a reason that place has been empty for 2 decades. It's built over a sinkhole, they say. Unstable. You'd be better off sleeping in a ditch." He smiled his thin, predatory smile. "But then, I suppose a ditch doesn't come with a key, does it?" He chuckled at his own wit and spurred his horse cantering down the street as if he had important business to attend to, leaving the scent of leather and superiority in the air. Lucinda didn't answer. She didn't look at him. She just kept walking toward the north end of town, where the buildings grew sparser and the prairie began to reclaim its own. The last structure before the open road was a small, neat cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. An old woman sat on the porch, wrapped in a colorful blanket despite the mild evening. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her hair 2 long braids of silver. She was Osage, and the townspeople regarded her with a mixture of fear and respect, calling her Quiet Water. She had been here before the town had a name, and they said she saw things others did not. As Lucinda passed, the old woman raised a hand, not in greeting, but to bid her stop. Lucinda paused, Dust coming to a halt beside her. The woman's eyes, dark and bright as a bird's, took in everything. The exhausted girl, the worn-out horse, the deed in her hand, the heavy key. She looked from Lucinda to the distant, hulking shape of the ice house, barely visible on the horizon. For a long moment she said nothing, the only sound the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. Then her voice, when it came, was low and resonant, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. "Some things," she said slowly, each word given its own space, "are buried not to be forgotten, but to be found by the right hands." Lucinda stared at her, the strange pronouncement settling in the quiet air between them. It was not a warning, not exactly. It felt more like a blessing or a riddle, The right hands. She looked down at her own, calloused and smudged with dirt. They did not feel like the right hands for anything. "Thank you," Lucinda murmured, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking her for. The old woman gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned her gaze back to the horizon, as if Lucinda were no longer there. The conversation was over. Lucinda gently tugged on Dust's lead and continued her journey. The mockery of the town faded behind her, replaced by the echo of the old woman's cryptic words. They followed her out onto the prairie, a small, puzzling weight in her heart, a counterpoint to the heavy iron key in her hand. The walk to the ice house took the better part of an hour, leading her away from the town and into the rolling, empty expanse of the prairie. The track was little more than two faint ruts in the earth, long since overgrown with stubborn weeds and prairie grass. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, and the air grew cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. The ice house stood on a low rise, its silhouette a dark, jagged shape against the dying light. As she drew closer, the clerk's words came back to her. A ruin. He hadn't been exaggerating. It was less a building and more a monument to decay. Constructed of thick timber and stone, it was built low to the ground, with more of its structure below the earth than above it. The roof, made of heavy planks and sod, had collapsed in the center, creating a gaping wound open to the sky. The massive timber walls, gray and splintered, sagged inward as if tired of standing. A thicket of thorny bushes grew against one side, and the whole place listed slightly, like a ship sinking into a sea of grass. A profound sense of disappointment washed over Lucinda. It was worse than she had imagined. Barlow's laughter echoed in her ears. An ice castle. Dust snorted softly, nudging Lucinda's shoulder with her nose, as if sensing her despair. Lucinda reached up and stroked the mare's neck, her touch a silent promise. "We'll make do," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. She approached the main door, a monstrous thing of oak planks bound with rusted iron straps. The keyhole was choked with dirt and cobwebs. It took her several minutes of scraping with a twig before she could insert the key. It grated, protested, and then, with a groan of metal that seemed to travel down into the very foundations, the lock turned. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It didn't budge. She pushed again, her boots slipping in the loose dirt, putting all of her weight and desperation into the effort. With a shriek of tortured hinges, the door scraped open just enough for her to slip through. The air that rushed out was a physical thing. It was cold, profoundly cold, and carried a smell she had never encountered before. The smell of deep earth, of perpetual damp, and of something organic and ancient. The smell of 20 years of compacted sawdust. Inside, the darkness was absolute. The last rays of sunlight were swallowed by the gloom. She fumbled in her satchel for the small lantern and tin of kerosene she had bought with the wagon money. Her hands trembled as she lit the wick, the small flare of the match seeming impossibly bright. She raised the lantern. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing a cavernous space. The walls were thick, insulated with packed earth. The floor sloped down into a vast, central pit, which was filled nearly to the brim with what looked like dark, loamy soil. The sawdust. It had darkened and decomposed over the decades, becoming a dense, peaty mass. The hole in the roof let in a shower of dirt and dried leaves, which had formed a small mound on the surface. The air was still and dead. It was a tomb. Exhaustion, heavy and final, settled on her shoulders. She couldn't stay in here, not tonight. She backed out, pulling the heavy door closed as best she could, and led Dust to the lee side of the building, sheltered from the wind. She laid out her thin bedroll on the dry ground, using her satchel as a pillow. As darkness fell completely, she lay and listened to the sounds of the prairie and the groans of the old building as it settled. It seemed to be breathing, sighing in its long, lonely sleep. A place buried not to be forgotten, but to be found. The words made no sense, yet they were all the comfort she had. The next morning broke cold and clear. Lucinda awoke stiff and sore, the thin bedroll offering little protection from the hard ground. The first order of business was survival. She found a small, seasonal creek about a quarter-mile away, its water running thin but clear over a bed of smooth stones. She drank deeply herself, then led Dust to the water's edge. The mare drank for a long time, her sides heaving. Lucinda knew she had to find grazing, but first she had to face the ice house. She needed to make it a shelter, not a tomb. Armed with the faint morning light and her small lantern, she pushed the great door open again and stepped inside. In the daylight, the place was less menacing but no less daunting. The sheer scale of the task ahead was overwhelming. The central pit, at least 40 feet across, and who knew how deep, was filled with the dark, dense sawdust. It had to be cleared at least in part to create a level living space. She had no shovel. She had only her hands and the flat lid of her cooking pot. It was a start. She began in a corner near the door, a section of the wooden floor that was still intact. She used the pot lid to scrape away the top layer of sawdust and debris. It was slow, back-breaking work. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and a beam of light shone down through the hole in the roof, illuminating a column of dust motes dancing in the still air. It was in this beam of light that she first saw it, a detail that didn't fit. Most of the floor surrounding the pit was made of thick, rough-hewn pine planks, laid parallel to the walls, but in the corner she was clearing, there was a single plank about 3 feet long that was different. It was oak, not pine. Its grain was tighter, its color a darker shade of weathered gray, and it was laid perpendicular to the others, an interruption in the pattern. It looked like a patch, a repair made long after the original construction. She ran her hand over it. The wood was rotten in places, but still solid. It was strange. Why would someone replace a single plank with a different kind of wood and lay it the wrong way? She filed the thought away. It was a curiosity, nothing more. Her priorities were shelter and warmth. She worked until her back ached and her hands were raw. By late afternoon, she had cleared a small area, about 6 feet by 6 feet, down to the floorboards. The air in the ice house seemed to have its own texture. As she dug deeper into the sawdust, which was damp and cool beneath the surface, she caught a faint, unusual scent. It wasn't the smell of rot or mildew. It was a sharp, metallic tang like old iron or copper, the kind of smell that clings to old coins left too long in a pocket. It was barely there, a ghost on the air, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the mismatched oak plank. She paused, sniffing the air like an animal. The scent was strongest near the floor. It was probably just a buried tool, she told herself, a dropped piece of hardware from the men who built this place. Still, it was another small thing that felt out of place. She stood up, brushing the dark sawdust from her dress. She had a space to sleep, a tiny island of order in a sea of decay. That night, she brought her bedroll inside, placing it on the newly cleared planks. She left the heavy door wedged open a crack to let in fresh air. As she lay in the profound darkness, the silence of the ice house seemed to press in on her. It felt like a listening silence, a waiting silence. The image of the single oak plank laid against the grain floated in her mind. It was a loose thread in the fabric of the place, a question without an answer. Days bled into a week, and the week stretched toward 2. Lucinda fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and her own exhaustion. Each morning, she would take Dust to the creek and find a new patch of sparse grass for the mare to graze. Then she would return to the ice house and work. Labor became her shield against despair. She scavenged fallen branches from a nearby copse of cottonwoods to fuel a small, makeshift fire pit she built outside. She used mud and grass to chink the gaps in the timber walls, stopping the worst of the wind. She found a section of the sod roof that was still intact and, with immense effort, managed to drag it over the hole, creating a crude but effective patch. The work was grueling, but with each small improvement, the ice house felt less like a grave and more like a refuge. And all the while, she continued to excavate the sawdust. She had found a rusted shovel head near the creek, and after fashioning a new handle from a sturdy branch, her work accelerated. She was determined to clear the entire floor space around the central pit. The sawdust came out in heavy, damp clumps, smelling of earth and time. Her silent companion through it all was dust. The old mare would stand just outside the open door for hours, watching Lucinda work, her presence a quiet, steady comfort. Sometimes Lucinda would talk to her, her voice soft in the vast space. "We'll need to lay in supplies for winter, old girl," she'd murmur, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow. "This place will be cold, but it's solid." The mare would flick an ear or give a low snort, as if in agreement. The physical labor was changing Lucinda. Her hands, already calloused, became tough as leather. The muscles in her back and arms grew defined. The hollow-eyed sorrow in her face was slowly being replaced by a sharp, focused determination. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. One afternoon, as she was clearing the last corner of the floor, her shovel struck something with a dull, heavy thud. It wasn't the sharp ring of metal on stone. It was a thick, resonant sound. Wood on wood. She stopped, her heart giving a sudden hard beat. She knelt down and cleared the last layer of sawdust away with her hands. It was the mismatched oak plank. She had cleared all around it now, and its strangeness was even more pronounced. It was the only piece of oak in a floor of pine. She remembered the faint metallic scent she had noticed on her first day. It was stronger here, emanating from the very ground beneath the plank. An idea, illogical and faint, began to form in her mind. This was not a repair, it was a marker. She took the blade of the shovel and wedged it into the crack between the oak and the surrounding pine. She put her weight on the handle, using it as a lever. The rotten edges of the plank splintered, but the main body held firm. She repositioned the shovel, found a better purchase, and pushed down with all her strength. There was a sharp crack, and the plank lifted a few inches. Underneath was not solid earth or foundation beams. There was only more of the dark, compacted sawdust. But this sawdust was different. It was darker, damper, and felt almost greasy to the touch. With a sense of trembling anticipation, she put the plank aside and began to dig with her bare hands. The metallic smell was strong now, unmistakable. Just a few inches down, her fingers brushed against something hard, cold, and unyielding. It wasn't a rock, it was flat with a distinct, sharp edge. She scraped away more of the dirt. A corner of dark wood emerged, bound with a strap of black, pitted iron. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the top of a box, a very old, very heavy box, deliberately buried and marked for someone to find. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the immense quiet of the ice house. For a long moment, she simply knelt there, her fingers resting on the cold iron strap. The world outside, the town Barlow, her grief, it all fell away. There was only this space, this silence, and the secret the floor had held for 2 decades. This was real, this was not a figment of her lonely imagination. A fierce, protective energy surged through her. Whatever this was, it was hers. It belonged to the ice house, and the ice house belonged to her. She had no tools for a delicate excavation. She had only her shovel and her own 2 hands. She began to dig around the edges of the box, her movements urgent but careful. The object was larger than she'd thought, a military-style footlocker or crate, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was heavy, solid. It took her the better part of an hour to clear the earth from around it, her muscles screaming in protest. Finally, it sat fully exposed in its shallow grave, a dark, oblong shape in the gloom. It was sealed shut, a heavy padlock on its hasp, so rusted it looked like a single solid lump of iron. There was no key. Of course, there was no key. She looked around the cavernous space, her eyes landing on the small pile of her father's things, his whetstone, and next to it, the one tool he had always kept with his belongings, a short, heavy crowbar. She had almost sold it for food money, but something had stopped her. It felt like a part of him. She retrieved it now, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in her hand. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the lid, next to the lock. She took a deep breath and pushed down. The old wood groaned, but held. She repositioned the crowbar, finding a better angle, and threw her entire body weight into it. There was a loud, splintering crack, and the hasp tore away from the wood. The lock fell to the floor with a dull thud. The crate was open. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. It creaked open, revealing the contents. The first thing she saw was a sheet of dark, oiled canvas laid carefully over the top. It was still supple and had protected whatever was beneath from the damp. She lifted the corner of the canvas, and she forgot how to breathe. Gold, stacks of it. The light from her lantern fell upon row after row of neatly stacked coins, their surfaces gleaming with a soft, buttery light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. They were double eagles, $20 gold pieces, bearing the mark of the United States Federal Mint. It was a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings, more money than she had ever seen or conceived of in one place. It was enough to buy the entire town of Redemption Creek 10 times over. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the top coin. It was cool and heavy, a solid, undeniable reality. But as she stared, mesmerized, she noticed something else tucked into a small, recessed compartment at the side of the crate. It was a leather pouch, tied with a simple thong. Her fingers, clumsy with shock, fumbled with the knot. She opened the pouch and tipped its contents into her palm. It wasn't more gold. It was a small, thin book, a ledger bound in worn black leather. She opened it. The inside was filled with neat, methodical script. The first page was a date, April 14th, 1864. Below it, a heading, Distribution of Assets. And below that, a list of names. She scanned the list, her blood running cold. She recognized them. Or rather, she recognized the family names. Silas Croft, the town's first blacksmith. Jebediah Stone, the former sheriff. Marcus Thorne, the merchant who had founded the general store. The founding fathers of Redemption Creek, their names etched into a plaque in front of the town hall. And there, near the bottom of the list, a name that made her gasp. Elias Barlow, Jedediah Barlow's father. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a single folded piece of paper, a note, its ink faded but still legible. It was short and direct. U.S. Army payroll, 4th Cavalry, derailed west of Springfield. A gift from Providence to build a new life. Split 16 ways, God forgive us. It wasn't a gift from Providence, it was theft. This wasn't a fortune, it was evidence. The prosperity of Redemption Creek, the wealth of its leading families, the power that men like Barlow wielded. It was all built on a lie, on a secret buried in the sawdust of a forgotten ice house. She closed the ledger, the weight of it far heavier than all the gold in the crate. The cryptic words of the old Osage woman echoed in her mind. Some things are buried not to be forgotten, but to be found by the right hands. She looked down at her own hands, covered in the dark, peaty sawdust. What was she supposed to do? This knowledge was a weapon. It could destroy the town, destroy the men who had built it, including the father of the man who had wronged her so deeply. The temptation for revenge was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. But it was more than that. It was a truth that had been waiting, patient and cold, for someone to give it voice. As she knelt there in the gloom, the silence of the ice house was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of soldiers who never got their pay, of a crime that had become a foundation. And she, Lucinda Hale, the girl with nothing, was now the keeper of it all. Just as this terrible new reality was settling upon her, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a gentle sigh all day, began to moan around the corners of the ice house. The sliver of sky visible through the crack in the door grew dark, a bruised purple gray. A blue norther. She had heard tales of them, sudden, violent storms that swept down from the plains, bringing with them a terrifying drop in temperature and gale-force winds. She scrambled to her feet, her mind snapping from the past to the immediate, desperate present. She quickly covered the crate, shoving the ledger back into its pouch and pulling the oilcloth over the gold. She dragged the heavy oak plank back over the hole, scattering sawdust over it to hide the seams. It was a clumsy concealment, but it would have to do. The first clap of thunder was a cannon shot directly overhead, shaking the very timbers of the building. A blast of frigid air forced its way through the door. She had to get dust inside. The mare was already pressed against the lee wall, her eyes wide with fear. Lucinda fought the wind to open the door wider, coaxing the terrified animal into the cavernous space. The moment the horse was inside, Lucinda threw her shoulder against the door, using the crowbar to wedge it shut against the howling gale. The storm hit with the fury of a physical assault. Rain and hail hammered against the patched roof. The wind shrieked, testing every chink and crack she had so painstakingly filled. The old building groaned and shuddered, but it held. Her work had been sound. The ice house, her ruin, was now a fortress against the storm. She lit her lantern, the small flame a defiant pinpoint of warmth in the vast, cold dark. Dust stood trembling but safe, her flank warm against Lucinda's side. For hours the storm raged. It was a physical and emotional collapse, a reflection of the chaos that had just been unleashed in her own heart. She huddled with the mare, the secret of the gold a burning weight in her mind, the storm outside a terrifying echo of the turmoil within. Then, above the roar of the wind, she heard another sound, a human sound, a faint, desperate cry for help, nearly swallowed by the gale. "Help, please, anyone." Lucinda's head snapped up. She strained to listen. It came again, closer this time. Someone was out there, caught in the storm. She looked at the wedged door, at the relative safety of her shelter. Her first instinct was to stay put, to protect herself, her horse, her secret. But the cry came again, weaker this time, laced with panic. It was the sound of a woman. Without a second thought, she grabbed the crowbar and fought the door open again, leaning into the wind. A blast of icy rain hit her face. Peering into the maelstrom, she saw them. A broken-down wagon, its axle snapped, and 3 figures huddled beside it. A man, a woman clutching her swollen belly, and a small, shivering child. They were the rescued strangers, delivered by the storm. "Here," Lucinda shouted, her voice torn away by the wind. "Over here." She waved her lantern, a beacon in the tempest. The man saw it and, half carrying his wife, they stumbled toward the light, their son trailing behind. Lucinda helped them inside, into the impossible safety of the old ice house, and barred the door once more against the raging night. The choice had been made for her. She was no longer just the keeper of a secret. She was the keeper of a shelter. The family collapsed just inside the door, soaked, freezing, and in shock. The woman was clearly in the late stages of pregnancy, her face pale and strained. The man, though exhausted, had a look of fierce gratitude. Their son, a boy of about 6, stared at Lucinda with wide, frightened eyes. "Thank you," the man gasped, his teeth chattering. "We broke an axle. The wind, we thought we were done for." Lucinda wasted no time. She gave them her own dry blanket, wrapping it around the woman and child. She stoked the small fire she had built in a makeshift hearth of stones, the smoke finding its way out through a gap in the eaves. It wasn't much, but it was warmth. She shared the last of her bread and dried apples, her own hunger forgotten. The ice house, the butt of the town's jokes, had become a sanctuary. The family, whose names were John and Mary, with their son Thomas, huddled by the small fire, their shivering slowly subsiding. John explained they were heading west to Oregon, hoping to claim a piece of land before the baby came. "We saw the roofline from the road," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It looked like a ruin, but it was the only hope we had." Mary, the pregnant woman, looked around the vast, shadowy space. She saw the quiet girl who had saved them, her worn dress, her calloused hands. She saw the old mare standing peacefully in the corner. She saw the neatness of the cleared floor, the patched roof, the determined little fire. "You've made a home here," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet awe. Lucinda just nodded, unable to speak. The simple, sincere words struck her more deeply than any praise she had ever received. She hadn't just been surviving, she had been creating something. A home. All through the night, as the storm howled outside, Lucinda tended to the family. She made a warm broth from her meager supplies for Mary, and sat with the boy, Thomas, telling him a quiet story to calm his fears until he fell asleep. In this act of sheltering others, she felt a profound shift within herself. The gold beneath the floorboards seemed less like a treasure or a weapon, and more like a responsibility. It was a tool, and she was its steward. When the first light of dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving a world scrubbed clean and unnaturally quiet. John, a carpenter by trade, insisted on helping Lucinda properly repair her roof patch and strengthen the door before he set to work on his wagon. As they left 2 days later, the wagon repaired with wood Lucinda had helped him find, Mary pressed a small, carved bird into her hand. "We won't forget this," she promised. "We'll tell everyone of the girl in the old ice house who saved us." Lucinda watched them go, her heart full. Word of Lucinda's act spread faster than a prairie fire. The family, stopping in Redemption Creek for supplies, told their story at the general store. They spoke of the fierce storm, their broken wagon, and the quiet, strong young woman who had taken them in, sharing what little she had. They didn't describe a ruin, they described a sanctuary. The townspeople listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. The girl they had mocked had shown more grit and charity than any of them. A few weeks later, a stranger rode into town. He was a tall, lean man with a calm demeanor and observant eyes. He wasn't a cowboy or a farmer. He wore a city coat, and he carried the quiet authority of the law. He introduced himself to the sheriff as U.S. Marshal Frank Taggart. He was following a cold trail, he explained, a decades-old rumor about a stolen Union Army payroll. His investigation had led him to this region, and a recent story he'd heard in a nearby county about a family sheltered in an old ice house had piqued his interest. The sheriff, a man who preferred to let sleeping dogs lie, pointed him north out of town with a shrug. Taggart found Lucinda splitting firewood outside the ice house. She saw him coming and stood straight, her hand resting on the axe handle. Watchful but not afraid, he tipped his hat. "Miss Hale, I'm Marshal Taggart." He dismounted and approached slowly. "I'm told you've made a home of this place." His eyes took in the solid repairs, the neat woodpile, the healthy-looking mare. "I'm also told you're a person of principle." Lucinda met his gaze and saw no threat there, only a deep, weary integrity. In that moment, she made her decision. She led him inside, and without a word she lifted the oak plank and showed him the crate. She showed him the gold, and she handed him the ledger. The marshal knelt, examining the coins, his expression unreadable. He opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the names. He read the note. He was silent for a long time. "I've been chasing this ghost for 5 years," he said at last, his voice a low murmur. "I never thought I'd find it." He looked up at Lucinda, his eyes filled with a profound, quiet respect. "There is a federal finder's fee for the recovery of government property, Miss Hale. 10%. It's the law." As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, another rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It was Jedediah Barlow. He had seen the marshal's horse tied outside the ice house and had come in a panic. He burst in, his face pale with sweat. "What's the meaning of this? This is private property." His eyes fell on the open crate of gold and the ledger in the marshal's hand. All the color drained from his face. He looked from the gold to Lucinda, and in his eyes she saw not just fear, but a dawning, horrified understanding. The secret his family's fortune was built on was lying exposed on the dirt floor. The marshal stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. The statute of limitations on this crime ran out a long time ago, Mr. Barlow, he said, his voice calm and level. The men in this book are mostly dead. The town is here. There's no justice to be had in tearing it all down now. He folded the ledger and tucked it into his coat. But the gold is returning to the federal treasury. And the truth, well, the truth is out. Barlow stared, speechless, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a hollow, defeated man. He was not arrested. He was not shamed with shouts or accusations. He was simply undone by a quiet truth, revealed by the girl he had cast out. He turned and stumbled away, a man suddenly burdened by the weight of his own history. The townspeople, who had followed at a distance, saw it all. They saw Barlow's retreat. They saw the marshal treat Lucinda not as a fool, but as an equal. Their laughter had long since died. Now, it was replaced by a silent, spreading awe. In the golden hour of a crisp autumn evening, Lucinda Hale stood before the ice house. The air was still, fragrant with the scent of wood smoke and curing grass. Marshal Taggart had departed that morning, taking the gold with him, but leaving behind a notarized federal draft for a sum of money that still seemed unreal to her. Her silent companion, Dust, grazed peacefully nearby, her coat filled out, her head held high. The old mare was no longer a picture of exhaustion, but of contentment. The ice house itself was transformed. It was no longer a sagging ruin, but a solid, respectable homestead. The roof was whole, the door hung on new, perfectly balanced hinges. A silent gift left on her doorstep by the blacksmith's son. The community, once a chorus of mockery, had begun to reach out in small, quiet ways. A basket of late-season vegetables from one family, a sack of flour from another. They were gestures of apology, of respect. They saw her now not as the fool who bought a ruin, but as the woman who had unearthed its soul and, in doing so, had shown them their own. The marshal, before he left, had asked her what she would do now. You could go anywhere, he'd said. Build a mansion in St. Louis. She hadn't answered him then. She hadn't known the answer herself. But now, standing here, watching the last light of the sun burnish the old timbers of her home, she knew. She looked at the solid walls, the shelter she had made from nothing. She looked at her own hands, strong and capable. She thought of the buried secret, the storm, the family she had saved. She had come to Redemption Creek seeking redemption, and had found it not in a name, but in the earth, in labor, in a forgotten structure. She murmured the words to the quiet air, a promise to herself and the prairie. They thought I bought an ice house, she whispered, but I was just buying back a foundation. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this journey. This has been a story about the quiet dignity of starting over, and how the greatest treasures are often hidden not for their value, but for their truth. If you were moved by Lucinda's story, we'd be grateful if you'd leave a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and remarkable destinies. Our next story takes us to the high desert of Nevada, where a lone prospector finds a letter in a bottle that will change the course of a river and a war. Until then, be well.